One of the markers of the reliability of the Gospels are undesigned coincidences. In an undesigned coincidence, two or more things come together, but without the authors trying to make it happen that way. An undesigned coincidence is a casual interlocking that points to truth. To better grasp the concept, consider this modern hypothetical example Dr. Lydia McGrew uses. Suppose that the police get a phone call that a bank robbery has occurred. They go to the scene of the alleged robbery and start questioning people who claim to have witnessed it. Now, imagine two alleged witnesses whose testimony fits together in the form of a question and answer. One says that the bank robber was wearing tennis shoes and that one of them was untied. The other says that when the robber ran out of the bank, he tripped and almost fell. But note, the person who mentions the tripping doesn't mention the untied shoelace, and the person who mentions the untied shoelace doesn't mention the tripping. This is an example of an undesigned coincidence. The untied shoelace could easily explain the tripping. It answers the question, why did the robber trip? The two statements fit together like pieces of a puzzle. Each witness seems to be describing one part of the larger picture of what happened. Since reality fits together, the statements fit together. With this in view, let's turn our attention to an example of an undesigned coincidence in the Gospels, the feeding of the 5,000. This coincidence begins with the Gospel of John. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now, the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread, so that these people may eat?" Now, this might seem insignificant at first, but you'll quickly see why this is important to ask. Philip is a little insignificant. So why Philip? Philip is not one of the most prominent disciples. In the Synoptics, he's just listed as one of the disciples, and he's only mentioned a few times in John. He's not one of the inner three like Peter, James, and John, who we see referenced countless times. And he's not the treasurer of the group. He's not carrying the money and doling out the purchasing of food or anything. That was Judas. So again, why Philip? Well, we find the answer when we connect three different passages. Look at Luke 9:10. When the apostles returned, they reported to Jesus what they had done. Then he took them with him, and they withdrew by themselves to a town called Bethsaida. Here we see that the feeding of the 5,000 took place near a town of Bethsaida, which was likely near the northeastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. If we switch gears to look at John 1:43 through 44 and John 12:20 through 21, these passages are unrelated to the feeding of the 5,000. John 1:43 through 44 is about Jesus' decision to go north to Galilee, and he asks Philip to go with him, and John mentions in passing that Philip was from Bethsaida. In John 12, some Greeks approach Philip asking to see Jesus, and John mentions the same thing about where Philip was from, though he doesn't explain what this has to do with the Greeks and their request. Now take a second and get a bird's eye view to see how this all fits together. Luke says that the feeding of the 5,000 took place near Bethsaida. John says, in telling about the feeding, that Jesus asked Philip where they could buy bread, but he says nothing at all about where all of this was taking place. And in two unrelated passages, John casually mentions that Philip was from Bethsaida. Add in the fact that in John 6:5 through 6, it expressly says in verse 6 that Jesus was testing Philip, knowing himself that he planned to feed the people miraculously. And that is very much in the way in which Jesus interacted with his disciples. He would have often said cryptic things or asked them questions merely just to draw out their responses as part of his own teaching. The fact that Philip was from that vicinity makes the question more pointed. If Philip is from the nearby town, Jesus, in a more modern way, is saying, "Philip, you're from around here. Where can we get bread for all these people?" So in this coincidence, a question is raised by John's account. It is answered only by putting together a statement in Luke with an entirely different and otherwise unrelated passage with John. This coincidence is complex and interesting. This makes any hypothesis of fabrication on the part of John extremely unlikely. If John made up the detail that Jesus asked Philip, intending it to fit together with the location of the miracle, It is highly improbable that he would have left out either the reminder of Philip's hometown or a mention of the location of the feeding, leaving the reader to find both of these for himself in other places, one of them in an entirely different gospel. The same is true of John if John happened upon a version of the story similar to Luke's, mentioning the location of Bethsaida. If the mention of Bethsaida was in some way influencing John's account, he would have been much more likely to mention the town than to invent a question to Philip, all the more so if Philip's connection to Bethsaida, mentioned in unrelated passages, was his own invention anyway. Adding on to this, John himself doesn't make any attempt whatsoever to harmonize his account of the feeding of the 5,000 with the accounts in the Synoptic Gospels. In fact, he leaves rather striking loose ends. For example, he does not mention that Jesus taught and healed people all day, as the Synoptics record. If all that we had were John's Gospel, we might get the impression that Jesus fed people immediately upon seeing them. Here's another difference. John tells about Jesus going up the mountain later on to escape the people who wanted to make him king, and only after that mentions that the disciples came down in the evening and embarked in a boat. This might give off the impression that they didn't even start down the shore until after Jesus went up the mountain. But in Mark 6:45 through 46, we learn that Jesus sent them away in a boat while he himself dismissed the crowd. This variation is not an irreconcilable contradiction, though. Different parts of the story can be taking place all at once. For example, Jesus may have sent the disciples in the sense of telling them to leave right away when all of them were some distance from the shore. It could then have taken them some time to make their way through the crowd into the boat, while Jesus was dismissing the crowd and eventually going up the mountain. With these events taking place at about the same time, each author has to tell about them in some order or other, and Mark does not have to mean that the disciples actually sailed away before Jesus dismissed the crowd. The independence of the accounts is quite obvious. John is not tailoring his account to fit with the synoptics in subtle ways. He's telling his own story as he knows it, so we can take it that when John's account of this even does fit together in casual detail with the synoptic gospels, it is not a result of fabrication at all. The clear independence of the accounts make these subtle coincidences evidence for the truthful testimony of the disciples.